Welcome sports fans to GenX Classic Sports, where we bring the nostalgia of our sports-filled youth into the present day. Grab your favorite retro jersey, crack open a cold one, and let's stroll down memory lane together.
Welcome back, everybody, and I just have to say we are proud to announce our first partnership with a great company, Aunt Susie's Granola, AuntSusiesGranola.com. If you love granola, then you're going to love Aunt Susie's Granola. Aunt Susie's is a 100% gluten-free kitchen. They've expanded their product offerings to include overnight oats and other kind of snacks. My favorite flavors are salted caramel and s'mores, so try those out. Aunt Susie's Granola is shipped coast to coast online with subscription service options. The owner, Erica, has generously offered our listeners a great deal from now until July 31st. Listeners of our little podcast can use the code GenX Classic Sports, all one word, GenX Classic Sports, for a 20% discount, one per customer. That's GenX Classic Sports, one word, for a 20% discount through July 31st at Aunt Susie's Granola, AUNT Susie's Granola.
Welcome to episode. This is going to end up being episodes 21 and 22 most likely. And tonight we're going to talk for a few minutes about Mid-South Wrestling, and where we're from, you spell that RASSLIN probably, Mid-South Wrestling. And I've got Brother Casey with me tonight, and I've got a guy that goes back as far as you can go back with us from the old neighborhood. I got Ken with us from the parts unknown Texas.
Bad Street, USA,
Texas. And he's a big wrestling fan with us back in the day. Now, before we get started on the thing we witnessed personally, if I remember correctly, and y'all please correct me, Saturdays went like this: cartoons till about 11 or noon, right? And then in some order or another, bandstand and wrestling came on after that. Am I kind of right about that? Does that sound familiar?
I remember Super Friends coming on at 7 o'clock.
That was early one, yeah.
Which my parents would get upset because they were wanting to sleep in, and we'd jump up at 6:30 to be ready for that.
Get sugared up, yeah.
Yeah, and then I remember, somewhere around noon or 1, the wrestling shows would come
I think wrestling might have came on, and then bandstand might have hit right after that. Dick Clark.
Yeah.
So anyway, the three of us, we go back to the same neighborhood, and we're, even by Arkansas and Louisiana standards, we're almost kinfolks. We grew up in the Mid-South area. We actually grew up right in the middle of the Mid-South area. And so that was must-see TV for us. And Ken, what I was telling Casey when he first got on here was that since I went down the rabbit hole of researching this so I wouldn't miss anything, everything that happened that we remember for Mid-South, it actually happened between about 1979 and about 86. That's about the entire lifespan of all this stuff that we remember. It's about a 6 or 7. It really wasn't even that long. It was more like 80 to 85, really.
Yeah, it's really shocking to think of how quick it was. It really, I know we're talking about Mid-South, but, there's the specter of the WWF that kind of comes in. And because Mid-South was doing so well, Vince McMahon comes down and starts plucking out all the stars from the Mid-South. And ultimately, that's kind of what killed it, is that its success killed it because it was doing so well.
Right.
That Vince comes in and starts going, I'll take that guy. I'll take that guy. And I was like you. I was shocked that it was such a quick run. Because it seemed like it was longer, but I guess when you're a kid, it seems a lot longer. But I was shocked at that too.
Casey, I know you were way younger than us, but do you kind of remember that time? I mean, God, you were 6, 7 years old. You do remember that?
Oh yeah, I love the characters and the personalities and all of that. And speaking of McMahon, I was looking at the list of people that were on episodes, and he's listed as being on an episode.
Yeah, it's
of Mid-South.
Yeah,
McMahon.
So I went down this major YouTube rabbit hole and the internet in general because you don't ever know what you remember is right versus maybe made up in your head. But I was kind of right about some stuff that at the time as a kid I wasn't really aware of, but I didn't realize that these guys were all regional and they all kind of borrowed talent from each other. That's why I was trying to tell myself, and Ken, you'll remember this too. I was trying to tell myself, I know I didn't dream it that Andre the Giant fought in Mid-South. I know I didn't dream Ric Flair fighting in Mid-South, but then I got to thinking, how could that be possible? And then I went down this rabbit hole and realized that these guys were, even though they were competitors, they also had to help each other out because they were all in the Southeast down there trying to stave off Vince McMahon Sr. and Vince McMahon Jr. So they loaned guys out to each other. That's why we remember how big of a deal it was if Kerry Von Erich floated through Mid-South or whatever. Do y'all remember that as well? Because I was really questioning my sanity going, there's no way Andre the Giant fought in Shreveport. Yeah, he did. And I found out how by doing all this research. But do y'all kind of remember anything about that?
Yeah, it's kind of like Casey was saying. It's kind of hard to, trace where these guys started because they were kind of, moving around all the time.
Yeah.
Because I was trying to think of who were the guys that were so big, because like you, I remember all these guys coming. I remember Kerry Von Erich coming in. I remember Ric Flair coming in for a while.
Yeah.
And they would come in and do their little, spiel, and then they would go on to another territory.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the gentleman's agreement that these guys had that, hey, we'll loan you our guy, you loan us your guy, we'll kind of do it, but we won't steal your guys. And that's where kind of Vince broke that code and started basically going, no, I'll steal your guy and I'll take him away and make you my own.
That's exactly what I found out. As a matter of fact, so a little history, in case y'all didn't catch it in y'all's reading, Bill Watts was actually wrestling in what they called the Tri-States area, which was Oklahoma and somewhere up there, maybe some Arkansas. And he he was a performer and a booker at some point, meaning he scheduled everything. And he ended up buying the Tri-State Wrestling from a dude named Leroy McGurk, who was a wrestler who got blinded in a car accident and ended up just being an owner and promoter. At some point, he got out of the business and Watts bought him out and ended up with Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. And then a weird thing about that was he worked out a deal where he could also work in Houston because he didn't want to conflict with the Von Erichs in Dallas. So he had Houston plus those other states I mentioned. And that became Mid-South in 1979. And then he moved the whole operation to Shreveport. The offices, the wrestlers, everybody pretty much just moved to Shreveport, which I found interesting. And the telecasts that we remember were filmed on the fairgrounds in Shreveport at the Irish McNeil Boys Club, which as soon as I read that, I remembered it exactly, that's exactly how they introduced it.
Mm-hmm.
And you hit it on the head, Ken. They had gentlemen's agreements saying, hey, if I'm lagging a little bit, can I borrow Flair for a week and let him come defend the NWA belt out of Georgia down here in the Superdome or whatever, and I'll send you JYD for a week. And that was how these smaller operations survived, by loaning guys out to each other, and then they'd write it. I didn't realize that Flair would dip into Monroe or Shreveport for a week and fight all over the country down there against Orndorff or whoever, DiBiase, and then he'd be gone. And, meanwhile, JYD's doing the same thing over there. So that's how it worked out. And as young kids, you're like, man, they said Andre the Giant's going to be on here next week. How's that possible? Now you know.
Well, they would also have, the way they would do that too, is they would have the, loser leaves town, or,
yes.
The so-and-so, they would do some kind of stipulation where this guy has to leave, and you're like, oh, well, it makes sense he's gone. It's not, oh, well, he was going to another place to wrestle.
Yeah.
But we didn't know that. There was no internet. There was you just knew he was on there. He got beat in a loser leaves town match, and then he's gone. And a couple of months later, he pops back in.
And because for half of that run, we didn't even have cable.
No.
And so what we didn't know was that he was just down in Florida wrestling and doing the same thing. Yeah, we had no idea that loser leave town means I loaned him out for a couple of weeks. We didn't know. At 10 years old, that was traumatic, for JYD to lose and leave town. But I was going to say, though, I did find some stuff about Bill Watts, where a lot of people online, there's a ton of podcasts about this if you want to go find them, but a lot of people give Bill Watts a ton of credit and saying he was truly innovative in his approach, because he had wrestled all over the country and he knew what he liked and what he didn't like. And so I'm just going to read you the bullet list that's very brief that I found of what he truly built the Mid-South on. Live and crazy crowds, characters who operated in the gray area between heel and baby faces. He liked the guys that weren't clearly one or the other. He liked physical, athletic wrestling. And if you'll remember, there were nothing but concrete floors around the ring. He had come from areas that used to pad the floor outside the ring, believe it or not. He didn't like that crap. That wasn't physical enough for him. And then the big one, I think, is that he had a sort of a knack for what they called episodic storytelling, like a soap opera. And so those were his big marks on the industry, as far as, this is how we're going to do it. And there's very few exceptions. And another thing he believed in is those guys kept their character all the time. He told bad guys, the heels, he said, don't sign autographs because you're too much of an SOB to do that. So don't do it out in public. And these guys are now telling these stories as they enter their 70s and 80s. And it's fascinating to hear these old dudes going, man, I couldn't even sign autographs for kids because Bill Watts had fired me if he heard I did that, because I was supposedly too mean to do it.
He was really big into kayfabe.
Kayfabe,
he was like, I think if I heard this correctly, he would even let them have the same locker rooms. Like the good guys had their locker room and the bad guys had theirs.
Yep.
And I remember it was a big controversy when I think it was JYD and Hacksaw Duggan had a wreck, and they were together, and at the time they were feuding.
Right.
And Bill Watts was ticked off. He was like mad at him because they decided to ride together to the next event, because he's like, hey, you guys are feuding, you can't do that. So he was big into that,
I don't know if y'all remember, but there was a rumor. Apparently, they stopped at the now defunct Junior Food Mart in our hometown a lot, and it makes sense when you realize they were driving from Shreveport to Little Rock and beyond quite a bit. I remember one time some older guys telling all the kids at Junior Food Mart that JYD and I can't remember if it was Orndorff or DiBiase. It was like you just said, it was somebody that should have been an enemy. They pulled up in like a Cadillac together or Lincoln Town Car or something fancy and got out and went in, used the restroom, grabbed a Coke and left, made it. And people spotted them and saw them. And it blew my mind, because I'm like, wait a minute, those guys hate each other. Why are they riding together? And Bill Watts did not like that stuff. He really didn't.
Bill Watts, when you look at it, he really was, he gave JYD his name. Yeah. He's the one that gave him the Junkyard Dog gimmick. He
hired him. He hired him out of Canada from Calgary. Yeah.
And he gave a lot of those guys their names, their gimmicks, that they ultimately ended up going on to become hugely rich and famous in the WWF. But he was the guy that kind of put them on the path.
He takes credit for naming Dusty Rhodes too in Florida when he was a promoter down there before he came to Mid-South.
And I don't know if this is true, and this is just my opinion, but I think you're right, Sean, in that he was kind of an innovator and at the time the WWF was doing the kind of superhero, where you had the big guys who were the good guys versus the bad guys. Yeah. It was black and white. There was no gray. Yeah. You had good guys and bad guys. And I think he kind of was really ahead of his time, because if you look at the Attitude Era, in the WWF or WWE at that time, when it started going to the kind of anti-heroes and the kind of gray areas, that's really what Mid-South Wrestling was doing back in the early 80s. They were just kind of ahead of their time.
Yeah, Casey, do you remember the Cold War stuff that he took advantage of? He had Russians and Arabs with Skandar Akbar. He was smart, man. He drummed up that America stuff with the Cold War going on.
Oh yeah.
Dick Murdoch coming into the ring with a army knapsack with a 6-pack of beer in it and his little folding army shovel. Remember that?
American Dream, Dusty Rhodes,
the American Dream. Ivan Koloff was the Russian guy that was probably from Minnesota or something, but he brought him in and put the trunks on him, made him act like he had the fuzzy hat when he came in the ring. And, he let Skandar Akbar assemble this crew of foreigners, and they truly were foreigners, some of them like Iron Sheik, for example. And, man, they drummed up that America patriotic Cold War thing, and Bill Watts, he was ahead of his time. It was the time. That's why he took advantage. It was like Rocky fighting Drago. I mean, that's what he was taking advantage of. But, yeah, man, you want to get everybody stirred up. Let them run into the Hirsch Coliseum spouting go Russia or whatever.
Go into Monroe with Skandar Akbar and see how far you make it.
Man, that poor guy probably, all indications are he was a pretty cool dude in real life, but that dude probably couldn't go to the grocery store,
Well, the other thing that I thought from my memory, and I kind of looked it up and it kind of, matched up was, now maybe he wasn't the first because like we said, all these guys were kind of stealing from each other ideas and stuff. But he was the first guy. Mid-South was the first time. Remember how tag teams used to be kind of the jobbers? It was just the guys who weren't really good enough to. He was kind of the first that I remember putting like two studs together. He put JYD and Dick Murdoch together. It's like they'll be tag team. And then the Fabulous Freebirds and all that. He was the one that the tag team for a while in Mid-South was kind of the biggest deal to have. Where usually it's the individual stuff, but.
Absolutely. That used to be kind of training ground for guys that weren't so good or needed to learn or whatever. And he took the A-list guys and had them feuding each other and all that kind of stuff. And I enjoyed the tag team stuff as much as I did anything else back in the day,
I thought the tag team, because the one we went to in El Dorado was, and I'll remember this to the day I die, was Cowboy, Dick Murdoch, and Junkyard Dog versus the Grappler and the Super Destroyer.
It was Bill Watts.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Bill Watts. Yeah,
Bill Watts himself.
Bill Watts.
Against Grappler and Super Destroyer.
Yeah, because one of the things I had to look up, because I thought it was Bill Watts, and then I looked it up, and at that time, Dick Murdoch and Junkyard Dog were doing it. I don't know why Bill Watts jumped in there and wrestled that at the time, but I thought that was what it was, and I was like, well, that's weird because I remembered it being Bill Watts. So I don't know if maybe Dick Murdoch had a little too much to drink the night before. And
it's really weird. So we were cleaning out Mom's attic and getting all of our toys and stuff, and Casey found the poster from back then that I
had one somewhere too. Yeah,
and it says on the poster Cowboy Bill Watts. So I don't know if to cut down on the traveling for some other guys or something, he stepped in and gave somebody like Dick Murdoch a break for a night or what, because I'll talk about it in a little bit, but I found a podcast that Jim Cornette does, and he reads his schedule from his day planner from 1984 Mid-South, and it's shocking how much driving they used to. That's why Junior Food Mart in our hometown was a stopping point for them, because you'll see when I read off some of this stuff. But Casey, since you were younger, Ken and I can go. I would assume he starts where I do, and in my mind, it was Ted DiBiase and JYD first. But who do you remember out of Mid-South? I know you can really remember WWE later on because it was kind of cartoonish and stuff. But back to the gritty North Louisiana stuff. Well, who do you remember first for you a little bit younger than us?
I definitely remember. To me, the big stars were JYD. Hacksaw.
He made his living there. I mean, he had been other places, but he really became a star down there.
Yeah. I remember the Von Erichs when they did show up. That was always a big deal.
That was the biggest deal in the world to me. Was Kerry. But they made such a huge deal out of him being the national shot put champion, and at 18 years old and all this. And man, it was a big deal when the Von Erichs wrestled.
I went down that rabbit hole one night of, you told me that a lot of those old episodes are on YouTube, and
you go watch them.
It was funny just watching that and those names coming back, like, oh yeah, and I'd forgotten. I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that guy. And,
Buddy Landell or whatever his name was. I saw one with him the other day and laughed. He's out there on podcasts left and right. So you pretty much remember the same guys we do. Another guy that wrestled in El Dorado that night was Bob Roop, I think. Remember him? ROOP. Mm-hmm. He wore the amateur wrestling singlet thing, that we used to laugh at.
Yeah.
Speaking of those guys, though, one of the things that Bill Watts did that I noticed, I'm not sure everybody did, but he hired a lot of former football players to be wrestlers. And these were some big, strong dudes. And I looked a bunch of them up that we remember the most. And JYD played college football and signed in the NFL. He just got hurt and he signed with the Packers, I think.
Yeah, Packers.
Paul Orndorff was like a 4-year stud at the University of Tampa in Florida. He's in their Sports Hall of Fame as a halfback and tight end. Hacksaw Duggan, I think, played football. Ted DiBiase played at West Texas State back in the day, and his mother was a wrestler, and his stepfather was a wrestler. Ernie Ladd played in the NFL, and
the big cat,
Ernie Ladd. And by the way, I didn't realize that Ernie Ladd was kind of the second lieutenant to Bill Watts. He had a ton to do with their booking and recruiting and promotion and everything. He had a lot to do behind the scenes as well as obviously in the ring. He was a big part of the operation.
I read where Ernie Ladd was kind of, what's weird about Bill Watts is if you look at him later on, he says some really kind of, things that ultimately get him fired from, WCW. Hank Aaron gets him fired because, he says some really insistent
which is
things.
Ironic because he was the first. I know what you're fixing to say. Go ahead.
he was really the first guy, and they said that Ernie Ladd was really the one that pushed him to let JYD be the champ, and that he really pushed, for black wrestlers to really get the stage, because at that time they were kind of, secondhand. They didn't get the main jobs and the championships. And
correct.
And JYD, I couldn't believe this. I read where they did I'm sure you've seen this. They did this thing, and they said who was the most popular athlete. Was it Pistol Pete Maravich, Archie Manning, or JYD? And it was JYD.
By a mile.
Was the most popular athlete.
That was a poll in the state of Louisiana to school-age children. Who's your favorite athlete? Can you believe that? JYD, I think, is still renowned as the first black heavyweight champion wrestler in pro wrestling. Yeah. And so that's and I don't know what happened later on with Bill Watts and Hank Aaron getting sideways. I kind of remember it, but for him to give Ernie Ladd as much responsibility as he did, because Ernie Ladd was kind of the mentor to Butch Reed and JYD and some of those guys.
Tony Atlas, that whole crew.
And if you think about it in the South, it's so ironic that this was the early 80s, not too far from civil rights, this and that going on in the Deep South. And JYD was the most popular dude by far in Mid-South wrestling. By far. It wasn't even close.
I remember, and this is something that I remember, hopefully, for my, my childhood memories, is I remember I'd gone to the concession stand. But it had been like a little, the match had ended before, and it was getting ready for the last match was JYD Cowboy Bill Watts versus the Grappler. And that was the big main event. And I was getting my food, and we were on the way back, and all of a sudden you hear that dun, dun, dun. And I mean, the entire crowd just exploded. It exploded. And I just remember as a kid, like the hair on the back of my neck standing up, I was just like, this is something that's a memory that I'll take to my grave, because I've never felt, at that age, that kind of energy and just the way that crowd popped like that. And that was everybody, white, black, everybody that was in that stadium.
It's kids and older people, and everybody loved it, man.
They wrote so many good stories with him, with the angles with him and the Freebird. Remember the Freebirds blinded him with a hair with hair cream. And by the way, the Freebirds, I think, were a Bill Watts creation. He took 3 random dudes and put them together. He saw the potential in he was the first guy that really saw the potential in a 3-man outfit. And they made a special rule in Mid-South that if you were a 3-man outfit, it didn't matter, but just two of them had to wrestle to retain the belt. So that kind of freed Michael. Hey, what the hell if I have balloons going in front of my face for? But that freed up the ability to kind of shuffle the lineup a little bit. But yeah, so the Freebirds blinded JYD. Ted DiBiase turned heel on him in '82, and that led to this whole Stagger Lee thing, which I thought was the best angle ever in Mid-South. And I don't even know if Casey remember. You remember the Stagger Lee story, Casey?
I don't guess.
So they made a big deal early on about JYD and Ted DiBiase being best friends. One of them was they were best men at each other's weddings and all this, and they were both babyface good guys. Well, 82-ish. They both ended up at this, I think it was in the Superdome. And by the way, when they wrestled in the Superdome, it was always 20, 30,000 people, which WWE wasn't doing, or WWF wasn't doing that at all.
No.
And they made this angle where the two of them would fight a friendly title bout for like the North American Championship that Mid-South only had, and at the very end of the match, DiBiase always wore this little glove. He loads the glove and knocks JYD out and turns heel. And then he went on a long run as the most hated dude in Mid-South. Well, that led to all kinds of craziness with Dick Murdoch and all this stuff. Well, they ended up with a tag team match of a loser leaves town because DiBiase had gone off and formed what he called the Rat Pack with Matt Bourne. Remember that name, Kenneth?
Yeah.
And somebody else. And it was a loser leave town match, and JYD had Mr. Olympia with him, the guy with the silver mask, or Mr. Wrestling #2, one of them. And they lost, and then Stagger Lee shows up, Casey. So there was another match back in Shreveport or somewhere on TV, and this dude that looked JYD was supposed to leave town for 90 days, and this guy comes into the ring head to toe covered in orange and green with a mask, and he looks a lot like JYD's body.
Yeah.
And he just keeps showing up trashing DiBiase, and Hacksaw Duggan had started it all by being dressed up like a gorilla, right, Ken?
Yeah.
He interfered in the loser leave town match. He was the third member of the Rat Pack. It was Duggan and DiBiase.
That's right.
Yeah.
He interfered in the match, so JYD and Mr. Olympia lose. JYD has to leave town, and then Stagger Lee shows up, and he's just, And so the bad guys are all complaining to Bill Watts that it's clearly JYD, and this goes on for weeks. I'm sure they fought this from New Orleans to Tulsa and back and forth over weeks and months. Well, 90 days, because that's how long JYD had to stay away. And finally, on a Shreveport television taping, they unmask Stagger Lee, and it's just some random dude. And, you could look at it pretty close and go, that ain't quite JYD's physique, but okay, we'll buy it, But anyway, that was the best angle ever because,
nice.
I mean, and for once, JYD wasn't in Texas or somewhere fighting. He was actually dressed up like Stagger Lee, interfering with everything DiBiase and them did for 3 months straight. And they milked that man all over the southern United States, I'm sure.
That you're in my wheelhouse now.
Did I remember that correctly? Because I did do the research, but I'm trying not to look at notes. That's pretty much how it went, I think.
I'm telling you, I remember the Stagger Lee thing so well because I remember when you got to remember.
That was in 82, Casey, 82. So you were 6 years old.
Yeah.
DiBiase and JYD had been tag team champions. They played it up like they were the best buds. And then when he betrayed him, like as a kid, I just could not believe it. I was
it was the worst thing.
I was shocked.
They were my favorite too. They were my favorite too by far.
Yeah. And then when Stagger Lee shows up, this, another guy we haven't mentioned that is Jim Ross, who started out in Mid-South and is probably the greatest wrestling announcer of all time. And I remember as a kid, like you said, Sean, I just remember going, man, that Stagger Lee, he looks just like JYD. He's using all his maneuvers. He's doing the thump and he's doing all this stuff. But Jim Ross would go, Stagger Lee used to beat JYD up in school. He was like the bully, and he had this whole story,
That was the angle.
I would go, okay, that sounds pretty plausible. It must be, the case.
JYD's childhood bully was Stagger Lee, and he brought him in to take it. Yeah.
He was tough. He's the one that used to beat up JYD and made him tough like that. And so Stagger Lee, was even tougher than JYD. And he just came in and beat the crap out of everybody for like 90 days. And it was so funny because it's like you were kind of in on it, but you were at the same time as a kid, you're just kind of going, well, this story sounds, it sounds believable,
Sure, yeah.
And I bought into everything else. So, but, like you said, the whole genius behind it is the wrestlers complaining about it the whole time. Just going, that's Junkyard Dog, that's not Stagger Lee. And then Jim Ross would come in and interview him, and he'd go, I'm Stagger Lee, I'm not,
And the great part though was they finally knock him out and unmask him, and it's not JYD anyway.
And it's a dude that weighs about 160 pounds, if I remember correctly. He didn't look anything like him.
He was built like a marshmallow compared to JYD.
Oh, that was if you think about it, think about how that's been copied, like when the Mega Powers broke up, Hogan and Macho Man were best buds, and then all of a sudden they broke up. That all started it. I'm sure they've been doing it before, but the first big time I remember was DiBiase and Junkyard Dog, because they were, like you said, they were the top tag team. They were like the most popular guys and all. They were the two guys that everybody wanted to be like. And then to see those guys turn on each other, it was just, I'd never seen anything. You'd seen betrayals before. You'd seen people turn on people and do stuff, but never
nothing like that.
Nothing like that. I'd never seen that before. And I was just like, couldn't believe it.
Yeah, absolutely. It was the betrayal of the worst kind by far. Who else do you remember, Casey? I know you remember DiBiase and JYD. Who does the younger Tyke remember from then?
Dusty Rhodes.
Dusty Rhodes, he did fight there some. He was one of those they'd borrow and they'd have about a week-long storyline for a guy coming in from somewhere else and challenging for the North American title, or vice versa. He'd bring the belt from Georgia and somebody would challenge him for a week, and they'd go all over the countryside, making that same storyline keep going, I'm trying to think.
I know there's one that Casey's going to remember, because I don't know if Casey was old enough, but Sean, you probably remember being in elementary on the playground and having to watch your back at all times for somebody trying to DDT you. During Jake the Snake's DDT run in Mid-South. I remember for it may have been 2 years, where you could not go on the playground without having your head on a swivel because somebody was going to try to DDT. Remember at school, I think they banned the DDT because so many people were doing it and people were getting hurt.
Jake the Snake had a run of good guy and bad guy at Mid-South. He turned, I don't remember where he started and which he turned to, but he definitely was there long enough. I think he was North American champion for a while. There was all kind of craziness. Yeah. Of course, if you've seen anything about him, that was probably the most tame his personal life ever was, because after that, man, he was, he was on a bender for decades after that, really.
He was definitely a guy that blurred the lines between good and good guy and bad guy. He was never completely one or the other. He always he was in that gray area. And I think that's what made him last so long is, if you look at these guys, a lot of them that burn out really quickly, that they burn red hot, but then they go is that they're one-trick ponies. They can't. Yeah. You got to always reinvent yourself, or you got to have something that can sustain it. And if you don't, eventually people are going to get tired of you. And I think that's the genius in Bill Watts is he kept those guys going from one side to the next. He kept it fresh. It was never the same old stuff.
And I mean, they played the long game on stuff like Stagger Lee and the long game on DiBiase being a heel. DiBiase even took a break from Mid-South and went to Georgia and Japan, I read, and was gone like most of a couple of years. He comes back and picks up right where he left off, being the most hated dude. And then there was a turn for him in 85 where he went back to the people's champion kind of reputation because of I don't remember. I've got notes over here, but basically, I think he and Dick Murdoch had it out or something over a contending for the belt from Ric Flair. That's what it was.
All right, everybody, we're going to stop this discussion right there at the halfway point or so, and we're going to pick back up in a couple of weeks with our second half of our discussion about Mid-South Wrestling. We appreciate you listening, and if you want to help us out a little bit, please like, please subscribe, and we appreciate you listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us on GenX Classic Sports, where nostalgia meets the thrill of the game. Tune in next time for more insightful discussions and memorable moments, brought to you by Pine Street Productions. Until then, stay passionate about sports and keep the memories alive.